the Superman who made Homelander look sane. Homelander is terrifying because everyone can see the instability under the smile. The jaw tightens, the eyes stop blinking, the voice stays soft for half a second too long, and suddenly, every person in the room understands that the most powerful man alive is not a hero. He is a celebrity weapon with the emotional control of a child and the public image of a savior. But Miracleman is disturbing for a different reason. He does not need to twitch in front of cameras. He does not need to beg for applause. He does not need to stand on a stage and force people to love him. By the end of his story, Miracleman becomes something colder, calmer, and harder to dismiss. A Superman-type figure who looks at human civilization and decides it can be redesigned. That is why this comparison is not as simple as saying Miracleman is more evil than Homelander. Homelander is frightening because he is unstable with power. Miracleman is frightening because he becomes certain with power. And certainty can be worse. The modern Miracleman story is not built around the usual evil Superman question. It does not only ask what would happen if a flying strongman killed people in public. It asks what would happen if a Superman figure was not magical, not chosen by destiny, not raised by perfect parents, and not guided by clean moral mythology. What if the government built him, feared him, tried to kill him, failed, and accidentally left behind something even worse? That is where Miracleman separates himself from most Superman deconstructions. His horror is not only personal corruption, it is structural. His existence touches intelligence agencies, alien technology, kidnapped children, secret experiments, false childhood dreams, superhuman reproduction, mass death, and finally, a new global order where ordinary human authority no longer sits at the top of the world. This is why Miracleman can make Homelander look sane. Homelander still belongs to a recognizable system. He is a corporate product. He is managed, marketed, feared, manipulated, and protected by institutions that want to use him. Vought can lie for him. The public can worship him. The government can hesitate around him. But the world still has some structure around his madness. Miracleman's story goes further. It asks what happens after the structure fails. Michael Moran does not begin as a god. He begins as a tired man with migraines, missing memories, and a word he cannot quite remember. The word is Kimota. When he speaks it, he does not simply put on a cape. He exchanges places with a superior body, a superhuman form created through a government-backed experiment that he was never meant to understand. That already makes him different from Superman. Superman's origin is about escape, adoption, and moral upbringing. Miracleman's modern origin is about abduction, control, and weapon design. One myth begins with a baby sent away from a dying planet. The other becomes a story about human beings using alien science to manufacture gods before realizing they cannot control what they made. And then there is Johnny Bates. Kid Miracleman is the part of the story where the Homelander comparison becomes almost too direct. He has the power. He has the false normal face. He has the cruelty. He has the childlike rot hidden under adult status. But even he is only one half of the nightmare. Johnny shows what happens when a superhuman becomes monstrous through corruption. Michael Moran shows what happens when the hero becomes too far above humanity to remain fully answerable to it. Miracleman is not disturbing because he is simply insane. He is disturbing because, in the end, he may be right about some things. War ends. Poverty is attacked. Famine is treated as a solvable failure instead of an eternal condition. Superhuman beings reorganize Earth from above. The world becomes safer, cleaner, and more advanced. But the price is that humanity no longer controls its own destiny in the same way. From Marvelman to Miracleman, the innocent hero rebuilt as horror. Before Miracleman became one of the most disturbing Superman deconstructions in comics, he was Marvelman. Marvelman was created by Mick Anglo and first appeared in 1954, published by L. Miller & Son in Britain. The character came out of a very specific publishing situation. British readers had been getting Captain Marvel material, but after Fawcett's superhero line ended in the United States, the British publisher needed a replacement. And Marvelman filled that gap. The structure was familiar. A young man speaks a magic word and becomes a super-powered champion. Billy Batson said Shazam. Mickey Moran said Kimota. The older Marvelman stories belonged to a cleaner, simpler age of superhero fantasy. There was Marvelman, Young Marvelman, and Kid Marvelman. There were strange villains, bright adventures, and a world where power could still be treated like a wish fulfillment machine. The surface idea was simple enough for a child to understand. Say the word, become the hero, save the day. In 1982, Marvelman returned in the British anthology Warrior, with Alan Moore writing and Gary Leach drawing the early material. The revival did not simply update the costume or make the fights more violent. It took the cheerful 1950s premise and interrogated it like evidence found after a crime. It does not begin by asking how strong Marvelman is. It asks why a man in the modern world remembers impossible adventures that should not make sense. When the series later continued through Eclipse Comics in 1985, the name changed from Marvelman to Miracleman for American publication. But the central idea remained the same. Take a childlike superhero fantasy and rebuild it as adult science fiction, political horror, and body horror. Michael Moran is not reintroduced as a shining icon. He is a middle-aged journalist. He is not standing above a city with perfect posture. He is a man whose own mind has locked away the most important truth of his life. That is already a major difference from Homelander. Homelander knows exactly what he is. He may lie to the public, but he does not wake up wondering whether his power was real. Michael Moran begins the modern story with a broken relationship to his own identity. The golden figure called Miracleman is not just a costume hidden in a closet. It is another body, another state of being, another version of him that has been separated from his ordinary life. The old Marvelman material makes that contrast sharper. In the 1950s version, the magic word is fun. It is a door into power. In the modern version, the word becomes evidence of control. Kimota is no longer just a heroic trigger. It is a switch connected to a secret experiment. The bright fantasy of transformation becomes something closer to a body exchange mechanism. That is why Miracleman is not just British Superman. He is a superhero myth turned inside out. The cape is still there. The flying is still there. The impossible strength is still there. But behind it is not destiny, morality, or divine blessing. Behind it is a lab. Marvelman began as a replacement for Captain Marvel. Miracleman became something much darker, proof that a children's superhero fantasy could be reassembled into one of the coldest power stories in comics. Project Zarathustra, the lab that manufactured gods. The word Kimota sounds like magic. In an older superhero story, the word would be enough. A boy says a secret phrase, lightning strikes, and the impossible happens. Nobody needs to ask how the transformation works. The modern Miracleman story asks all of it. And the answer is Project Zarathustra. Project Zarathustra is the secret program behind the Miracleman family. It is run through the Spook Show, a covert branch of British Air Force intelligence, and led scientifically by Dr. Emil Gargunza. The project begins after a key spacecraft crash lands in Wiltshire, England in 1948. The whole origin is rooted in the Cold War imagination. Secret government departments, stolen alien technology, military panic, and the desire to create a weapon before someone else does. Mike Moran, Dickie Dauntless, and Johnny Bates are not chosen by prophecy. They are orphans. That single fact strips the origin of romance. These are not noble volunteers. They are not adult soldiers who consent to an experiment. They are children without enough protection, taken into a system powerful enough to erase the difference between rescue, recruitment, and abduction. Gargunza uses Q-Wise technology to create superhuman bodies connected to the children's ordinary human selves. The magic words allow them to exchange places with those bodies. Mike becomes Miracle Man. Dickie becomes Young Miracle Man, and Johnny becomes Kid Miracle Man. But even that does not fully explain the cruelty. The children are not simply transformed and sent into the world. They are placed inside a dream state. In that artificial world, they believe they are having bright superhero adventures. They fight villains. They save the day. They act like the Miracleman family is a real heroic team. Outside the dream, the lab is watching. That is the part that makes Project Zarathustra so ugly. The adventures are not just harmless illusions, they are conditioning tools. Gargunza is not giving children a fantasy to make them happy. He is testing responses, shaping behavior, and studying how superhuman bodies react while the human minds attached to them are fed a controlled narrative. The dream world is a cage painted like a comic book. This is where Miracleman becomes more disturbing than a simple, evil Superman story. Homelander is a product of corporate parenting, emotional starvation, and branding. Miracleman is the product of military science, alien theft, and psychological engineering. Both are manufactured supermen, but Miracleman's origin has an extra layer of violation. He was made to believe the lie was his life. That changes how we read the old adventures. Dr. Gargunza, in the dream, appears as a strange, recurring villain. But in reality, Gargunza is the man behind the entire system. He turns himself into fiction inside the minds of his victims. He lets them defeat a cartoon version of him while the real version monitors them from outside the dream. Gargunza writes the world they think they live in. He decides what enemies they fight and controls the shape of their heroism. And this matters deeply for Michael Moran later, because when he finally remembers Miracleman, he is not merely recovering a lost superhero career. He is recovering evidence of what was done to him. That is why Project Zarathustra is the true beginning of the nightmare. The nightmare begins when human authorities decide that gods can be manufactured, controlled, and trained through fantasy. The 1963 atomic betrayal, when the state tried to kill its own supermen. The British government does not end Project Zarathustra with an apology. It ends it with a bomb. By 1963, the Miracleman family has become too dangerous to continue. The same people who wanted superhuman weapons eventually realized that superhuman weapons may not remain weapons. They may become independent beings with memories, desires, judgment, and power far beyond the institutions that created them. So the state chooses disposal. The operation is built around a lie. The Miracleman family is brought out of the dream state and sent toward what they believe is another heroic mission, a threat connected to a sky fortress hovering over the North Sea. In the false adventure logic they have been conditioned to accept, this sounds like the kind of crisis they were made to solve. But there is no ordinary villain to defeat. The mission is a trap. Sir Dennis Archer, the controller of the spook show, launches an atomic strike against them. This is not a failed experiment going wrong by accident. This is a deliberate military decision to kill the Miracleman family before they become impossible to manage. Young Miracleman dies. Dickie Dauntless is the cleanest victim in this part of the story because he represents the child soldier the system used and then erased. He does not become the God King, but he is destroyed in the very operation meant to wipe away the evidence. Michael Moran survives, but not as Miracleman. He wakes up burned, injured, and human, with broken bones and no memory of his life as a superhuman. That is one of the coldest fates in the entire origin. The state does not just take his childhood, use his body, and trap his mind in a dream. It leaves him alive without the context that could explain his own suffering. He becomes a survivor who does not know what he survived. That is why Michael's later headaches and dreams matter. They are not random dramatic symptoms. They are pressure cracks in a buried history. His body has moved forward in time, but part of his identity is sealed behind trauma, conditioning, and government violence. Then there is Johnny Bates. Kid Miracleman survives too. That is the mistake that poisons the future. Johnny wakes up in a hospital with burns and a concussion, but unlike Michael, he keeps his memory. He knows what happened. He knows who he was. He knows the power was real, and eventually, he becomes the worst possible survivor of the project. A child with access to godlike power, no moral structure strong enough to contain it, and decades to rot inside his own superiority. Homelander is dangerous because he was raised inside a system that never let him become emotionally normal. Johnny Bates is dangerous because he was pulled into a government superhuman program as a child, survived the attempt to kill him, and then carried that corruption forward into adulthood. The difference is that Johnny does not need a boardroom, a marketing department, or a public relations machine to tell him he is special. He has lived the truth of it. The 1963 betrayal also explains why Miracleman's story can never return to classic superhero comfort. Once the government uses an atomic bomb against its own manufactured heroes, the genre changes. The Bright family team is gone. The magic word adventure is dead, and the secret origin is no longer charming. Every institution in the story is compromised. Michael Moran wakes up, the forgotten Superman returns. Michael Moran does not return like a legend. He returns like a man who has been worn down by a life that never quite made sense. That is important because the modern Miracleman story does not reintroduce him as a confident savior. He is a middle-aged freelance journalist with a strained body, recurring migraines, and dreams that feel too vivid to dismiss. He remembers fragments, not the whole word at first, just the sense that something is buried inside him, something enormous, something that should have been obvious but was somehow hidden for years. That is the emotional shape of Michael Moran in the beginning. A man haunted by a self he cannot access. His marriage to Liz Moran makes that return more grounded. Liz is not just a passive witness to the miracle. She is the person who has to stand closest to the transformation and ask what it means in practical, human terms. When Michael becomes Miracleman again, the situation is not simply romantic or triumphant, it is disturbing. Because Miracleman is not Michael with better posture. He looks different. He speaks from a place of certainty Michael does not have. His body is not the tired body Liz has lived beside. It is perfect, powerful, and untouched by the years that aged Michael Moran. The transformation does not feel like a costume change. It feels like another being has entered the room using her husband's life as the doorway. That is one of the smartest choices in the story. A normal superhero transformation gives the audience pleasure. Clark Kent opens his shirt and the Superman symbol appears. Billy Batson says Shazam and becomes Captain Marvel. Bruce Banner becomes the Hulk, and the change is dangerous but visually clear. With Michael Moran, the transformation carries a more intimate question. Is this still the same man? The memories connect them. The identity connects them. But the body is different, and the emotional temperature is different. Michael is anxious, damaged, and uncertain. Miracleman is calm, beautiful, and increasingly remote. The more the story develops, the harder it becomes to pretend that one is simply the secret identity of the other. That is why Michael's awakening is not just a power restoration. It is an identity crisis. The forgotten Superman has returned, but the human being who remembers him has to live with the consequences. Michael learns that his lost dreams were not fantasies. He learns that his heroic past was not heroic in the way he believed. He learns that the Miracleman family was not a natural miracle, but the result of Project Zarathustra. And he learns that the men behind the project did not merely create him. They lied to him about what his life was. This is where Miracleman becomes much more psychologically invasive than Homelander. Homelander's horror is usually external. He enters a room, and everyone else is in danger. Michael Moran's horror begins internally. His own mind is unreliable. His own memories are compromised, and his own body is not the final version of himself. Liz understands this faster than most characters would. She does not treat Miracleman like a simple blessing. She notices the gap between Michael and the golden being. She recognizes that power changes the conditions of intimacy. Michael's return is not only about stopping villains. It is about what happens when the superhero body comes back into domestic space. The kitchen, the bedroom, the marriage, the medical fear, the private conversation after the impossible thing has happened. That is where the story becomes uncomfortable. And Michael himself is not fully prepared for the truth. He wants answers, but every answer makes his life less stable. Kimota gives him power, but it also opens the door to the experiment. Miracleman gives him strength, but also separates him from ordinary humanity. By the time Michael Moran wakes up to who he really is, the old superhero fantasy has already been poisoned. The forgotten Superman has returned, but what returns with him is not hope alone. It is evidence. Kid Miracleman, Homelander before Homelander. Johnny Bates is the part of Miracleman where the Homelander comparison becomes impossible to avoid, but the comparison is not exact. Homelander is a man raised inside corporate worship. His entire identity depends on cameras, applause, branding, approval, ratings, and fear. He wants to be adored because something inside him is empty. Johnny Bates is colder than that. He does not need a stadium to tell him he is special. By the time Michael Moran finds him again, Johnny has already lived with the truth of his own superiority for almost 20 years. That makes him worse. Johnny Bates was not born as Kid Miracleman. He was one of the children used by Project Zarathustra, alongside Mike Moran and Dickie Dauntless. Like the others, he was placed into the dream state system and made to believe he was part of the Miracleman family's bright, heroic adventures. In the dream, he was the boy sidekick. In the laboratory, he was a test subject with a superhuman duplicate body waiting in infraspace. Then, 1963 happens. The government launches the atomic strike. Young Miracleman dies. Michael Moran survives, but loses his memory. Johnny Bates survives too, except his situation is different. He wakes up with memory intact. He remembers the power. He remembers the Miracleman identity. And unlike Michael, he does not spend the next 19 years as a normal human being trying to understand broken dreams. He stays connected to the monster. As an adult, Johnny becomes a businessman. He builds wealth and influence through sunburst cybernetics. On the surface, that makes him look respectable. That mask is important because it is exactly what makes him terrifying. When Miracleman meets him again, Johnny is not introduced as a drooling villain or a simple brute. He appears successful, controlled, civilized. The horror is not that everyone can immediately see what he is. The horror is that he has been walking around in human society for years while something much older, stronger, and more corrupt has been living behind the face. Then, the mask breaks. In his first major confrontation with Miracleman, Johnny shows that Michael is not the strongest superhuman in the room. Kid Miracleman has spent far more time in transformed form. His body has aged into adulthood, while Michael's Miracleman form has not carried the same continuous experience. That gives Kid Miracleman a brutal advantage. He is stronger, more practiced, and far less restrained. Miracleman does not defeat him because he is more powerful. He survives because Johnny makes a mistake. Kid Miracleman accidentally says the transformation word and reverts to the human Johnny Bates. The godlike body disappears, and what remains is a boy who has been trapped behind his own superhuman self for years. Johnny then falls into a catatonic state and is placed under care. That outcome makes the character even more disturbing, not less, because it reveals that Kid Miracleman is not simply Johnny Bates with powers. There is a psychological split between the frightened human child and the dominant superhuman identity. The superhuman form is not just stronger physically, it is the bully in the body. It controls, dominates, and terrifies the weaker human self. That is where Johnny becomes more disturbing than Homelander. Homelander is emotionally childish, but he is still one continuous adult personality. Johnny Bates contains a trapped child and a corrupted superhuman persona that has had decades to grow cruel. The result is not just narcissism, it is identity horror. That is why Kid Miracleman is not simply an evil Superman parody. He is what Project Zarathustra produces when the experiment is not interrupted by amnesia. Michael forgets and becomes damaged. Johnny remembers and becomes rotten. The same program creates both the returning hero and the nightmare waiting for him. So when people say Miracleman made Homelander look sane, Johnny Bates is the first piece of evidence. But unlike Homelander, Johnny does not seem desperate for the world's approval. He already knows the world is beneath him. Dr. Gargunza, Liz Moran, and Winter, the human cost of superhuman design. Dr. Emil Gargunza is not frightening because he can punch through buildings. He cannot. Miracleman already has superhuman bodies, alien technology, flying gods, and city-level catastrophe. But Gargunza brings the horror back down to something human. A scientist who treats children, women, bodies, memory, and identity as materials for a project. He is the mind behind Project Zarathustra. He is the man who uses QY's technology to create the Miracleman family. He is the one who keeps Mike Moran, Johnny Bates, and Dickie Dauntless inside a dream state where their superhero adventures can be monitored, managed, and studied. But Gargunza is not finished with Michael after the truth comes out. His later plan centers on Liz Moran's pregnancy. That is where the story becomes biological instead of just military. Miracleman is no longer only a weapon created by the state. He is capable of producing a child, and that changes the scale of everything. A superhuman being having a child is not just a family development. It means the experiment can move from laboratory accident to species-level future. Gargunza understands that faster than almost anyone. He kidnaps the pregnant Liz because he wants the child. His goal is not sentimental. He does not want to raise Miracleman's daughter. He wants to possess the child's body and continue his own life through it. That is the coldest expression of who he is. Even a newborn is not a person to him. A child is a vessel. A body is property. Miracleman's family is just another system he thinks he can control. This matters because it exposes the deeper logic of the entire Miracleman myth. The story is not only about power being abused by the powerful, it is also about people with ordinary human bodies trying to steal permanence from the bodies they created. Gargunza builds gods because he is mortal. He studies children because they can become what he cannot. He wants winter because the future has arrived in a form he thinks he can occupy. And Liz becomes the center of this horror. She is the human person forced to carry the consequences of the superhuman world inside her own body. Michael's transformation already damaged the normal terms of their marriage. Because Miracle Man is not simply Michael with a better costume. Now Liz's pregnancy proves that there is no clean boundary between their domestic life and the cosmic experiment. The bedroom becomes part of Project Zarathustra's aftermath. The marriage becomes part of the species question. And Winter is born into a world that has no category for her. Winter is not a normal superhero baby. She develops at a level that makes ordinary infancy almost meaningless. She speaks, thinks, and grows with a speed that separates her from normal human expectations. Even as a newborn, she is not really helpless in the way human children are helpless. Her existence forces the story to admit what Miracleman's body has always implied. These beings are not just stronger humans. They may be the beginning of something else. That is why Gargunza's plan is so disgusting. He is not trying to steal a weapon. He is trying to steal the first stage of a new form of life. Miracleman eventually kills him, but killing Gargunza does not solve the larger problem. The scientist dies, but the questions he created remain. Who owns a body built by stolen alien technology? Who controls a child born from a superhuman form? Does Winter belong to her parents, to the future, to Earth, to the Keys, or only to herself? Those are not normal superhero questions. Superman stories often ask what a good man should do with power. Miracleman asks what happens when power reproduces, when biology becomes political, and when a child is born already beyond the world that expects to raise her. Gargunza's death closes one chapter of abuse. Winter opens something much larger, because once she exists, Miracleman is no longer just the result of an experiment. He is the start of a lineage. The London Massacre, the moment Homelander comparisons stop being enough. London is where the old rules die. Before that, Miracleman can still be discussed as a dark superhero story. There are secret experiments. There is a corrupt government program. There is an evil scientist. There is a monstrous former sidekick. There are alien politics and body-switching technology. The story is already disturbing, but it still feels like a superhero narrative being taken apart piece by piece. Then, Kid Miracleman returns. Johnny Bates had been contained after his first defeat, locked in a catatonic state while the superhuman identity waited inside him. That containment fails. Kid Miracleman comes back, and what follows is not a fight scene in the usual sense. It is a massacre. The number attached to it is 40,000. 40,000 people dead in London. That figure matters because it removes any possibility of treating Kid Miracleman like a stylish villain. This is not one murder meant to shock the hero. This is not a building collapse used as spectacle. This is a national wound, a mass casualty event caused by a single superhuman who has no human restraint left. This is where the Homelander comparison becomes too small. Homelander is terrifying because people know he could do something like this. Kid Miracleman actually does it. He turns the fear into history. He proves what one corrupted Superman-level being can do to a city when there is no army, no police force, no government, and no ordinary superhero structure capable of stopping him quickly enough. The response requires more than Miracleman alone. Miracleman fights with allies, including Miracle Woman, the Warpsmiths, and other superhuman forces. As a Chorn of the Warpsmiths becomes crucial. His method is not based on overpowering Kid Miracleman directly, because that may not be possible in a clean way. Instead, he uses warp-smith teleportation with terrible precision, placing debris into Kid Miracleman's body to weaken him from the inside. That tactic tells us how bad the situation is. This is not a clean Superman punch. This is battlefield surgery against a living apocalypse. Asa Chorn dies helping stop him. Even beings from beyond ordinary human categories pay a price in this battle. Kid Miracleman is not merely too strong for humans. He is dangerous to other superhuman and alien-level beings as well. Then comes the final decision. Kid Miracleman is forced back into Johnny Bates. The god body disappears, and the human boy is there again. This is the most morally brutal moment in the entire conflict. Johnny is not standing there as a triumphant adult villain. He is the human form, the child self, the vulnerable body behind the monster. Miracleman kills him. There is no comfortable way to read that moment. If Johnny lives, Kid Miracleman can return. If Kid Miracleman returns, the massacre can happen again. The story traps Miracleman in a decision where mercy toward Johnny may mean mass death for everyone else. So he chooses execution. That is one of the clearest places where Miracleman stops functioning like a traditional superhero. Superman would look for another way. Captain Marvel would believe the child could be saved. Most superhero comics would build an escape hatch, a prison, a cure, a magical separation, a last-second intervention. Miracleman gives us the colder answer. The child dies because the god inside him is too dangerous to risk. That is why London changes everything. After 40,000 dead, the world cannot go back to pretending superhumans are just costumed figures who fight villains and then disappear. A single corrupted miracle has exposed the weakness of every human institution. No government can honestly claim control anymore. No army can promise safety, and no court can handle what just happened. London is not only Kid Miracleman's worst crime. It is the event that creates the political excuse for Miracleman's world. After this, when Miracleman and his allies step forward as a pantheon, they are not arriving in a normal world. They are arriving in a world that has just learned what helplessness means. Olympus, when Miracleman's utopia actually works. After London, Miracleman does not return to a secret identity. He does not defeat Kid Miracleman, disappear into the clouds, and let governments continue as if nothing has changed. He does not go back to being Michael Moran, freelance journalist, and he does not pretend the old world still has the authority to manage what has happened. Instead, a new order begins. Miracleman, Miracle Woman, the Warp-Smiths, Moors of the Keys, and other superhuman or alien-linked figures become a pantheon. That word is not accidental. They are not simply a team. They are gods in the political and cultural sense. They stand above the old systems, and from that position, they begin changing Earth. Olympus rises from the ruins of London. The image matters because it makes the new age impossible to separate from the massacre that preceded it. Miracleman's paradise is not built in a neutral place. It rises from the site of catastrophe. The city that proved humanity could not protect itself becomes the foundation for a world where humanity is no longer fully in charge. And here is the uncomfortable part. The new world improves. War is ended. Famine is treated as a solvable failure. Poverty is attacked directly. Technology and alien knowledge reshape daily life. The dead become part of a new system after Moores creates an underworld. Superhuman children become part of the future. Miracle Man and Miracle Woman do not merely punish criminals. They redesign civilization. That is why this story is more disturbing than a simple tyrant plot. If Miracle Man became a screaming dictator, the moral answer would be easy. If he behaved like Homelander, murdering people for applause and melting anyone who looked at him wrong, the audience would know exactly where to stand. But Miracleman's golden age is not written as pure failure. It has beauty, it has order, it has peace, it has results human governments could never achieve. That is the trap. A world without war sounds like salvation. A world without famine sounds like mercy. A world without poverty sounds like justice. But the method is not democratic. Humanity does not collectively vote itself into this future. It is reorganized from above by beings ordinary people cannot meaningfully resist. The gods are benevolent, or at least they believe they are. But benevolence does not erase the power imbalance. That is the real terror of Olympus. Miracleman does not need to threaten humanity every morning. His power is deeper than that. He changes what people expect from reality. He changes birth, death, politics, religion, economics, and the meaning of human progress. He makes himself unnecessary as a superhero because he becomes something larger. A ruler, a symbol, a father of the next stage. Marvel's history points to thousands of superhuman children connected to Miracleman's new order. That detail is crucial because Olympus is not only about controlling the present, it is about manufacturing the future. The question is no longer whether Michael Moran can punch harder than Johnny Bates. The question is whether ordinary humanity remains the central species on Earth. Homelander wants to be worshipped as the strongest man alive. Miracleman helps build a world where worship becomes socially reasonable, not because he demands it with a tantrum, but because his works appear miraculous. If a being ends war, cures scarcity, raises the dead into a managed afterlife, and fathers a generation beyond normal humanity, what word do people use for him? Hero starts to sound too small. Politician makes no sense. Dictator feels incomplete if the results are real. God becomes the language people reach for because every other category breaks, and that is why Olympus is so unsettling. Miracleman's utopia does not fail in the obvious way. It asks something more difficult. If a godlike ruler creates peace, abundance, and a better future, does that make his rule acceptable, or does it simply make the cage beautiful? Why Miracleman makes Homelander look sane. Homelander makes power look unstable, but Miracleman makes power look inevitable. That is the difference. Homelander is frightening because he is visibly damaged. He needs love. He needs applause. He needs to be seen as the hero even when everyone close to him understands that he is dangerous. His violence comes from insecurity as much as cruelty. He is a godlike celebrity with the emotional structure of a neglected child. That is terrifying, but it is also recognizable. Miracleman goes further. His story does not stop at the idea of a Superman figure becoming cruel. It begins with a fake golden age and then digs under it. Michael Moran is not chosen by destiny. He is not sent from Krypton by loving parents. He is not raised under a clean moral code on a farm. He is an orphan used by Project Zarathustra, shaped by Dr. Emil Gargunza, controlled by the Spook Show, and connected to superhuman technology stolen from the Keys. That alone already makes Miracleman colder than most Superman deconstructions. But the story does not stop there. The government tries to kill its own creations with an atomic strike in 1963. Young Miracleman dies. Michael survives with amnesia. Johnny Bates survives with memory and becomes Kid Miracleman, one of the most horrifying Superman-like figures in comics. That is where Homelander starts looking almost small. Homelander is one corrupted Superman inside a corporate empire. Miracleman contains an entire system of corrupted supermen. The damaged survivor, the child monster, the dead sidekick, the abducted miracle woman, the scientist who wants immortality, the aliens who recognize the technology, and the pantheon that eventually replaces ordinary human authority. If Kid Miracleman is the nightmare of power without conscience, Michael Moran is the nightmare of power with certainty. And certainty is harder to defeat. A monster can be exposed, a tyrant can be hated, a celebrity fraud can be humiliated. But what do people do with a godlike being whose rule produces peace, abundance, and progress? That is the uncomfortable genius of Miracleman. It does not let the audience hide behind easy answers. Kid Miracleman's London Massacre gives us the obvious horror: 40,000 dead, a city turned into proof that one superhuman can break civilization. But Olympus gives us the harder horror: a better world built after the massacre, governed by beings no one elected and no one can remove. That is why Miracleman is scarier than Homelander. Homelander is a warning about celebrity, corporate power, emotional abuse, and unchecked violence. Miracleman is a warning about what happens after humanity loses the argument. Michael Moran begins as a victim. He is not born cruel. He is used, lied to, damaged, and robbed of his own history. When he becomes Miracleman again, there is a real tragedy in him. But by the end, tragedy has become authority. The victim of a secret project becomes the center of a new world order. The man who was once controlled becomes the being who helps control everything. That reversal is what makes the story so powerful. It does not say power automatically turns someone into Homelander. It says power can turn someone into something quieter, cleaner, and more convincing. And that may be worse, because Homelander's madness announces itself. Miracleman's divinity can be admired. Homelander makes people afraid of the man in the cape. Miracleman makes people question whether the cape should rule. So the final verdict is this: Miracleman made Homelander look sane because his story went beyond the evil Superman fantasy. It did not only ask what happens when Superman kills. It asked what happens when Superman is manufactured, manipulated, betrayed, awakened, reproduced, worshipped, and finally placed above the future of the species. That is not just a superhero nightmare. That is a civilization nightmare. So what do you think? Is Miracleman a hero, a god, a dictator, or the most honest Superman deconstruction ever written? And which part of his story deserves a full breakdown next? Project Zarathustra, Kid Miracleman, The London Massacre, Gargunza, Winter, or Olympus? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy deep dives into disturbing comic history, Superman deconstructions, broken heroes, and stories that take familiar icons somewhere much darker, make sure to like, subscribe, and stay with the channel.